In 2015, UNESCO's Global Monitoring Report stated that the world has not achieved education for all. In addition to this, UNESCO also reported that inequality within education has increased, with the poorest and most disadvantaged shouldering the heaviest burden.
Significantly, a suggestion made by UNESCO intended for future consideration was that the international community must sustain and increase aid to education. However, this approach conflicts with the perspectives of a range of academics who blame the corruption and wasting of international aid in Africa and India for having very little or no effect on improving education for the poorest.
One of UNESCO's 6 goals from Dakar 2000 was ensuring that by 2015 all children have access to and complete free and compulsory education of good quality.
However, at a time where Education for All was about to commence their 15-year strategy, the exposure of low-cost private schools serving some of the poorest children from developing countries came to the attention of academics.
James Tooley, assigned by the World Bank's International Finance Corporation to study private schools in developing countries, documented how low-cost private schools were prevalent in the slums and shanty towns of India.
There were widespread concerns with how appropriate low-cost private schools were in relation to their Education for All agenda.
However, Tooley, Dixon and a range of other academics have supported the role of low-cost private schools in helping to achieve the Education for All goals. Even Kevin Watkins, previous lead author of UNESCO's Education for All Global Monitoring Report, acknowledged that a lower-cost private sector has emerged to meet the demands of poor households.
Moreover, according to Pauline Dixon, there is denial about the existence of low-cost private schools operating in the poorest regions of Africa and South Asia. This has resulted in low-cost private schools being categorised as either low-cost private schools that operate under the radar or low-cost private schools that gain government recognition.
The inability of developing countries to deliver a high-quality public education has led to widespread public dissatisfaction in government education systems where parents feel obliged to seek alternative provision.
Within a global context, when we further investigate the countries in which low-cost private school provision has seen an unprecedented rise, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index illustrates high levels of public dissatisfaction and a lack of trust in government institutions, for example, the police service, judiciary and education.
In stark contrast, when we examine the Corruption Perceptions Index ranking of the countries which top the PISA rankings, excluding China which is subdivided into regions, there is a clear and significant difference in the levels of trust that the public has in their government's institutions.
As an average, across 5 of the countries in which the number of low-cost private schools is continuously increasing, a Corruption Perceptions Index rank of 116.2 is observed.
On the other hand, this contrasts with an average Corruption Perceptions Index rank of 12.2 for the countries which are recognised by PISA as having the 5 best education systems in the world.
Therefore, the lack of trust in government services in countries such as India, Nigeria and Uganda goes some way to justifying the prevalence of low-cost private school provision in such developing countries.
Interestingly, however, Finland, whose education system is widely regarded as one of the best in the world, has no private schools and no competition between schools because these 2 factors are recognised as invariably causing segregation.
However, it is not possible to apply Western notions of privatisation in a global context. The high levels of public dissatisfaction in governmental institutions means that the replication of westernised education systems is problematic. Therefore, alternative strategies of providing better education in developing countries can prevail.
This diversity of private providers in both the more developed and developing countries raises the question of what is meant by the terms private, low fee, low cost, and even school. Philipson discusses the issues of defining low-cost private school provision and claims that it is easier to explain what a low-cost private school is not, rather than what it is. Indeed, he proposes a rather cynical and narrow definition of low-cost private schools. The low-cost private school is a school owned by an individual, individuals, or other form of commercial enterprise for the purpose of making a profit. Surely then, a for-profit motive towards education is not the most effective way of eradicating educational inequality in developing countries.
Now that's where you are wrong. According to James Tooley and David Longfield, the privatisation of education that is occurring in developing countries can be defined as de facto privatisation. This is a bottom-up or grassroots process where the people themselves are engaged in reassigning education to private rather than state control and ownership. Often, the actions of the people are antithetical to the wishes of the state, Moreover, the actual cost of low-cost private education has been calculated to be 4.2% of the monthly wage for a breadwinner on minimum wage in India.
Okay, that does not sound a lot, but these people do not have a lot in the first place. To better contextualise the low cost of low-cost private schools, I examined Jeeba's contract. Ironically, in 2017, James Tooley released plans to introduce low-cost private schools across England. Fees of just £52 a week are said to meet parental demand. Audience, imagine you're Jeeba. Can you afford £208 a month per child out of your £1,198.50 a month wage? Even a rate of 4.2% of Jeeba's monthly wage would equate to £50.34 per child per month. Surely these schools are not the answer to education for all.
Admittedly, the concept of poor families in India paying for private education is disconcerting and does not align with the Education for All agenda. However, James Tooley highlights how unrecognised low-cost private schools offer informal scholarships to some of the poorest pupils. Tooley proposes that the state should introduce a voucher scheme to allow the poorest pupils to attend private school. This is a concept which has worked successfully in Colombia and Pakistan. Most notably, the latter implemented a voucher system to engage girls in education, a key concern for UNESCO.
First of all, in the words of Geoffrey Walford, a key concern with low-cost private schools in India is with the quality of the schooling provided. Teachers who are untrained, unqualified and paid a pitiful wage on the one hand, and schools, which often lack basic facilities, on the other hand, are exploiting poor parents and wasting their very limited incomes. Furthermore, Philipson terms the deceitfulness of low-cost private schools as successful selling of the superficial, where props of education such as books and a computer are on display to dupe parents into thinking that low-cost private schools are far superior to the government-run alternative.
Government schools are not without their own problems, which means many poor parents aren't sitting around patiently. And why should they? There are a range of factors which have contributed to parents becoming disillusioned with the education offered by the Indian government. Across India's government schools, there are issues with teacher absenteeism, appalling standards of provision, language of instruction, inadequate conditions, high hidden costs, and government expenditure. Additionally, a range of studies have reported that low-cost private schools have a higher level of attainment than their public counterparts. So why the denial about, first, the existence of low-cost private schools, and second, their contribution towards the Education for All agenda?
Why the denial, you ask? Well, first of all, as Rose and Adelabu suggest, the Indian government had made a commitment to universal primary education. Thus, we can attribute their ignorance of low-cost private schools to the theory of soft power, whereby governments subscribe to global policy agendas to improve their country's reputation on a global scale. A second reason for the denial is the credibility of such schools because of their questionable knowledge of teaching, learning and pedagogy. Typically, one such example is the language of instruction. A significant difference in attitudes resides here. Private schools often provide instruction in English from first grade, which parents perceive to be desirable, whereas Indian government schools do not typically introduce English until 5th grade. Despite there being a need for English language teaching in India, trained teachers, as found more commonly in government schools, are paramount for its successful implementation.
Okay, to conclude then, it seems fair to suggest that the debate over low-cost private school provision is a highly contentious one. In the words of Peter Wilby, is Professor James Tooley a champion of low-cost schools or a dangerous man?
Firstly, James Tooley is an advocate of low-cost private schools and financially supports the social enterprise Omega Schools franchise in Ghana. Furthermore, the Department for International Development's rigorous literature review of low-cost private schools questions some taken-for-granted assumptions about the provision.
There are significant gaps in the evidence, and that available research is context-specific. However, the rigorous literature review was highly contested by James Tooley and David Longfield.
Is that the reply to which Joanna Harmer said that her research had been manipulated and quoted selectively? Not to mention saw Mr. Powell's questioning of Tooley and Longfield's use and interpretation of her research.
Okay, I agree that research remains relatively dearth, and conclusions drawn by James Tooley especially must be treated with a degree of scepticism. As a recommendation, I believe that there needs to be an expansion of government statistics functions in India so that low-cost private schools are regularly included in the calculations of enrolment rates, and thus contributions made towards the Sustainable Development Goals can be better monitored.
I agree. Such collaboration between education providers in India would reciprocate the recommendations of Verma, Bagley and Jha, whose 3 C's, choice, consideration and collaboration, respects the rights of all children. After all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does state everyone has the right to education.
And do not forget that it also states parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children.
So, it appears that there is a place for low-cost private schools in India then.
Yes, currently there is a place for them to combat the failings of a corrupt government system. However, there needs to be a 4th C added.
And that is compromise. In conflict with low-cost private schools, the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals all state that
education should be free.